At a get-together party, he laughed and said, "She has no job, don't worry. I'll take care of her after marriage." Everyone laughed. He smirked proudly, while she just smiled in silence. They left the party without paying the bill. The waiter tried to speak, but she stopped him with a gentle nod. The next morning, he and his friends received termination letters. Furious, they stormed into HR, demanding answers. "Meet the owner," HR said coldly. When they entered the office, their faces froze. His fiancée sat on the owner's chair, calm, powerful, and no longer smiling. Her words shattered his life. "Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter Stories. May the Almighty surround your life with unshakable peace and fill your soul with the warmth of His mercy. May every breath you take remind you that you are deeply loved, chosen, and protected by His grace. May every woman rise with courage and pride, every man walk in truth and kindness, and every child grow under the wings of pure love. I pray your hearts never run out of hope, your homes never run out of light, and your dreams never fade with fear. May joy live beside you, may faith lead before you, and may God's gentle hands lift you through every storm and into endless blessings. If your heart is true, like the video. If your love is real, write, "I am with Mr. Peter." Wealth whispers while poverty screams, and Linda Klein had learned the art of silence long before she learned to speak. The gallery walls held amateur paintings that would never sell, created by artists who would never be famous, displayed for an audience that would never remember them. Linda stood before a canvas splattered with colors that meant nothing yet somehow meant everything. She wore jeans from a store where people checked price tags twice, a simple black sweater with no designer label, and shoes she'd walked in long enough to scuff. Her hair fell natural around her shoulders, her face bare, except for the faintest touch of lip balm. She looked like every other woman in this room, and that was precisely the point. "You see something in that one?" Linda turned. The man beside her had kind eyes and restless hands that couldn't quite stay still. He gestured at the painting, an explosion of reds and golds that looked like either a sunset or a kitchen fire, depending on your optimism. "I see someone trying," Linda said, "trying to make sense of chaos. Trying to create beauty from confusion." "That's generous," the man smiled. "I just see a mess. Maybe mess is honest. Maybe perfection is the real lie." He laughed, not politely, but genuinely. "I'm Matt Mercer, Linda Klein." They shook hands. His grip was firm, but not aggressive, confident, but not dominating. She noted these things the way someone might note the weather, casually, but with awareness that storms could be coming. "You come to these often?" Matt asked. "Gallery openings. When I can. I like seeing what people create when they're not trying to impress anyone. But isn't that what art is? Trying to impress?" "No," Linda turned back to the painting. "Art is trying to express. There's a difference." Matt moved beside her, studying the canvas with renewed interest. "You talk like someone who thinks deeply about things. I talk like someone who's learned that surface level gets you nowhere meaningful." "Cryptic." Matt's eyes sparkled. "I like cryptic." For the next hour, they wandered through the gallery together. Matt talked about his work, something involving planning and coordination and deadlines that Linda listened to without asking too many questions. He had ambition in his voice, hunger in his gestures, dreams painted across every sentence. He wanted to build something meaningful, he said. He wanted to matter. Linda asked questions that revealed nothing about herself. Where did he grow up? What made him choose his path? What did he value most? Matt answered everything with openness that felt both refreshing and slightly naive. "What about you?" Matt finally asked as they stood before the last painting, a simple landscape that somehow captured loneliness. "What do you do?" Linda had rehearsed this answer 100 times. "I'm figuring that out." "Figuring it out?" "Neat. Trying to understand what I'm meant to contribute. What matters beyond just existing." Matt nodded slowly. "That's brave. Most people just take whatever job pays the bills and call it a life." "And you?" "No, me." Matt's chest expanded slightly. I'm building towards something bigger, climbing, growing, making my mark. There it was, that quality Linda had seen in so many people. Not greed exactly, but hunger. The need to prove something to someone, maybe to themselves. She found it endearing in its honesty, dangerous in its blindness. "What mark do you want to leave?" Linda asked. Matt paused, considering. "I want people to know I existed, that I did something that lasted beyond my own life, that I took care of the people I love and gave them everything they deserve." "Everything they deserve," Linda echoed. "Or everything you think they should want." The question landed between them like a stone in still water. Matt blinked, caught off guard by the gentle challenge in her voice. "I never thought about the difference," he admitted. "Most people don't." They moved toward the exit together, the gallery emptying around them. Outside, the evening had turned cool, streetlights beginning their nightly ritual of pushing back darkness. "Can I walk you somewhere?" Matt asked. "Or call you a ride?" "I'm fine walking. I like the night. Then can I walk with you?" "Just a few blocks?" Linda smiled. "Just a few blocks." They walked in comfortable silence initially, their footsteps falling into rhythm without effort. Matt kept glancing at her as if trying to solve a puzzle he'd only just realized existed. "You're different," he said finally. "Different how? You don't fill silence with noise. You don't try to impress. You just are." "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" "It's terrifying," Matt said, but he was smiling. "Most people I meet, I figure them out in 5 minutes. You? I could talk to you for 5 hours and still feel like I'm standing at the edge of an ocean." Linda felt something warm bloom in her chest. Not just attraction, but recognition. This man, with his hunger and his dreams and his restless hands, saw her as mysterious, not because she was hiding, but because he sensed depth. "Maybe oceans are worth diving into," Linda said softly. Matt stopped walking. They stood beneath a streetlight that cast everything in amber. "Can I see you again? Actually see you, not just accidentally run into you." You could. Tomorrow, coffee." The coffee sounds perfect." Matt pulled out his phone. "What's your number?" Linda recited it slowly, watching him type with focus that suggested this number mattered more than most. When he finished, he looked up at her with something vulnerable in his expression. "I know this sounds strange, but I feel like I've been waiting for this conversation," Matt said. "Like everything up until tonight was just preparation." Linda felt her heart constrict. Here was sincerity. Here was a man saying something real, offering something genuine. And here was she holding back an entire world he couldn't imagine. "Tomorrow," she said simply. "The cafe on Maple Street morning. I'll be there." They stood for another moment, neither quite ready to break the spell. Then Matt did something unexpected. He extended his hand again, formal, respectful. "Thank you for tonight," he said, "for seeing something in that mess of a painting, for talking to a stranger, for being you." Linda took his hand. "Thank you for asking what I saw, instead of telling me what I should see." She walked away before the moment could become anything else, before her courage could falter, before she could second-guess the decision forming in her mind. She would give him the truth of her heart. Everything else, the buildings with her family's name, the accounts that could buy galleries like the one they'd met in, the influence that made people's voices change, all of that could wait. 3 blocks later, when she was certain he couldn't see, Linda stood at the corner and looked back the way she'd come. Matt was still there beneath the streetlight, watching the space where she'd been, his hands in his pockets, his expression caught between joy and wonder. Linda pulled out her phone and called someone who'd been waiting for this call her entire life. "Mom?" "Darling." "How was the gallery?" "I met someone." Her mother's pause was delicate, knowing. And I'm going to see where this goes. Really see. Without all the rest of it clouding everything." "That's brave." "Linda." "Or stupid." "Sometimes they're the same thing." Her mother's voice carried warmth that felt like arms around shoulders. "Just remember, whoever he falls in love with, make sure it's actually you." "That's the plan." Linda ended the call and looked up at the building beside her, 47 floors of glass and steel and ambition. the penthouse on top, holding everything she'd walked away from tonight. Tomorrow, she'd return to her modest apartment across town. Tomorrow, she'd meet Matt at a cafe and drink coffee that cost less than the earrings she'd left on her dresser. Tomorrow, she'd continue this experiment in truth. But tonight, standing between two worlds, Linda Klein made a promise to herself. She would know if Matt Mercer could love her, truly love her, before he ever learned what loving her meant. The streetlight flickered once, then held steady, and Linda walked into the night with hope, fragile as glass and twice as precious. Chapter 2. The Courtship of Illusions. Morning arrived with the kind of light that made ordinary things beautiful, and Linda sat in the cafe on Maple Street, watching people rush past windows, chasing things they'd forget by evening. Matt arrived exactly when he said he would, slightly out of breath, carrying flowers that looked like he'd picked them himself from somewhere that didn't sell flowers. Wildflowers, actually, daisies and stems Linda couldn't name, wrapped in newspaper. "I know it's traditional," Matt said, offering them with boyish uncertainty. "But I saw them and thought about last night, about what you said about honest mess being better than perfect lies." Linda took the flowers, their stems still damp, their petals uneven but vibrant. "They're perfect." They sat across from each other in a corner booth, coffee steaming between them like a barrier neither was quite ready to cross. Matt talked, nervous energy spilling into words about his morning, about the route he'd taken here, about how he'd almost worn a different shirt before deciding that overthinking clothing was ridiculous. "You're nervous," Linda observed gently. "Terrified," Matt admitted. "I don't usually feel this way." "What way?" "Like something important is happening, and I need to not mess it up." "What if you can't mess it up?" Linda stirred sugar into her coffee slowly. "What if the only way to fail is to be someone you're not?" Matt considered this, his fingers drumming that restless pattern on the table. "You have this way of saying things that sound simple, but feel complicated. Or maybe complicated things are actually simple. And we just prefer complicated because it feels more impressive." "There you go again," Matt laughed. "Turning my brain inside out." They talked for 2 hours without noticing time passing. Matt told her about growing up in a house that was full of love, but empty of extras, about parents who worked hard to make sure their children had opportunities they'd never possessed. He spoke about wanting to honor that sacrifice, to build something that would make his family proud. Linda listened to every word, asking questions that drew him deeper into himself. She learned that Matt valued loyalty above almost everything, that he'd once given up a promotion to recommend a colleague who needed it more, that he couldn't stand dishonesty even when the truth was difficult. "What about your family?" Matt asked eventually. "You never talk about them." "They taught me that appearances can be deceiving," Linda said carefully. "That people show you what they think you want to see. What do you want me to see?" The question landed with weight. Linda met his eyes directly. "I want you to see me making the choice to be here. Not because I have nowhere else to be, but because this is where I want to be." Matt reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of hers. "Can I ask you something that might sound strange?" "Ask. Do you feel it too? This thing between us that doesn't have a name yet." Linda's breath caught. "Yes." "Okay." Matt exhaled like he'd been holding something heavy. "Okay, I just needed to know I wasn't imagining it." They left the cafe together as afternoon began bleeding into evening. Matt walked her through the city, pointing out places that mattered to him. The corner where he'd first arrived with everything he owned in one bag. The building where he'd gotten his first real job. The park bench where he'd sat and cried when his father died. Linda absorbed each confession, each vulnerability, feeling the weight of his trust. He was opening doors to rooms most people never saw, and he was doing it without expectation of reciprocation. "You don't talk about yourself much," Matt said as they watched ducks navigate a pond that probably violated several health codes. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. Start anywhere." Linda chose her words like stones in a path. I learned early that people want versions of you that fit their stories. So I got good at being whatever version seemed kindest. That sounds lonely. It was survival. And now, Linda turned to face him fully. Now I'm trying something radical. I'm trying to be just myself and see if that's enough. Matt took her hand, the first real contact beyond handshakes and accidental brushes. His palm was warm, slightly rough, completely certain. It's enough, he said quietly. It's more than enough. They stood there while the sun set over water that reflected nothing honestly, and Linda felt herself falling. Not the breathless tumble of infatuation, but the deliberate descent of someone choosing to trust gravity. Weeks folded into each other like origami. Matt and Linda constructed a relationship from small moments. Shared meals in diners where the food was terrible, but the company transformed everything. Walks through neighborhoods that smelled like other people's dinners. Long conversations that started about nothing and ended up somewhere profound. Matt introduced her to his world carefully. His colleagues were exactly what Linda expected. Ambitious people climbing toward visions of success they'd absorbed from magazines and motivational posters. They gathered at bars after work, their laughter too loud, their certainty too brittle. Derek Lansing was Matt's closest friend at work, all sharp edges and sharper observations. Troy Whitmore spoke in sports metaphors that made every conversation feel like a game someone was winning. Cameron Hayes had the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. "Guys, this is Linda," Matt said the first night he brought her to their usual place. Derek looked her over with eyes that appraised everything. "The mysterious girlfriend. Matt talks about you constantly. Does he?" Linda smiled. "I hope it's all terrible so I can exceed expectations." Troy laughed. "She's funny. I'd like her. What do you do, Linda?" Cameron asked, the question casual but loaded. "I'm figuring that out," Linda said, the practiced answer rolling smooth. "Figuring it out?" Derek exchanged a glance with the others. "That's code for unemployed, right?" "Derek," Matt's voice carried warning. "What? I'm just asking. No judgment. We've all been there." Linda felt the shift in the room, that subtle recalibration people make when they think they understand your value. She saw herself being filed under a category, saw assumptions clicking into place behind friendly smiles. "I'm between things," Linda said calmly. "Deciding what matters enough to commit to. Must be nice having that option," Troy said. "Some of us have bills." Matt stepped closer to Linda, protective. "She's exploring her options. Nothing wrong with that." "Of course not," Derek said quickly. "We're just giving you grief. Linda, welcome to the group." But Linda heard the unspoken sentence beneath the welcome. "She's pretty enough that Matt can afford to carry her weight for a while." Later, walking home, Matt apologized. "They don't mean anything by it. They're just assuming I need to be taken care of," Linda finished. "It's fine, Matt. I'm used to people making assumptions." "You shouldn't have to be used to it." Linda stopped walking, turned to face him under the weak glow of a streetlight that had seen better decades. "Does it bother you that I don't have a traditional job? That I can't talk about promotions and targets?" "God, no." Matt took both her hands. "You're the most interesting person I've ever met. You see things nobody else sees. You ask questions that matter. You make me want to be better than I am. Do you see me, Matt?" "Really see me?" "I see someone extraordinary trying to convince the world she's ordinary," Matt said. "I see someone who's been hurt enough to build walls, but brave enough to let me climb them. I see the woman I'm falling in love with." The words hung between them, fragile and enormous. Linda felt tears threaten, not sad tears, but the kind that come when something true cuts through layers of protection. "I'm falling too," she whispered. Matt kissed her then, gentle and certain, and Linda let herself believe that love could be simple, that two people could choose each other without contracts and complications, that the man holding her face like she was precious could love her for reasons that had nothing to do with everything she'd hidden. Walking back to her modest apartment, Linda pulled out her phone and sent a single text to her assistant. "Continue standard operations. I'll check in as needed." The response came immediately. Understood. Everything runs smoothly. Take your time. Linda smiled at the truth hidden in plain sight. Yes, everything ran smoothly. She'd built systems specifically so she could stand on sidewalks kissing men who thought she needed protection. Men who couldn't imagine that she held influence that could reshape their entire world with a signature. She climbed the stairs to her apartment. 4 floors up. No elevator. Walls thin enough to hear neighbors arguing, and felt content in this small space. Matt thought this was her life. Matt thought he was seeing all of her. And maybe, Linda thought as she arranged the wildflowers in a jar that had once held pasta sauce, maybe the version of herself that lived here was the truest one. Maybe the woman who wore the crown was the disguise, and the woman who climbed these stairs was the revelation. Her phone buzzed. Matt, thank you for tonight. For every night. For being you. Linda typed back, thank you for seeing me. But as she hit send, she wondered which version of herself she was thanking him for seeing, the one he thought he knew, or the one she kept locked in buildings he'd never enter. Chapter 3. The Ring Without Truth. The proposal came on an ordinary morning that became extraordinary without warning. The kind of transformation that makes you believe in magic even when you've learned better. Matt had suggested a walk through the park where they'd first kissed, nothing unusual, just time together before the day demanded their separate attentions. Linda wore comfortable clothes, her hair pulled back against the wind that couldn't decide which direction it preferred. They walked past joggers chasing health they'd abused by evening, past families teaching children that grass was meant for rolling in, past elderly couples who'd forgotten they were supposed to have become strangers after so many years together. Can we sit? Matt asked, gesturing toward the bench where they'd spent hours talking about everything except the things that mattered most. Linda sat, noticing that Matt's hands had that restless quality again, the one that meant nervousness or excitement or both tangled together. I've been thinking, Matt began, then stopped. Started again. I've been thinking about the future, about what I want my life to look like when I'm old enough that walking in parks feels like an accomplishment. That's oddly specific, Linda said gently. I want it to look like this. Matt gestured between them. Like us. Like mornings that don't need plans because the company is the point. Linda's heart began beating in a rhythm that felt like anticipation and dread playing the same instrument. Matt slid off the bench, kneeling on grass that would stain his pants, pulling a small box from his pocket with hands that trembled just enough to be honest. Linda Klein, I don't have much. I don't have the kind of security that lets me promise you everything. But I have love that's real and commitment that won't waver and the absolute certainty that you are the best thing that's ever happened to my life. He opened the box. The ring inside was modest, a simple band with a diamond small enough to be practical, beautiful enough to mean something. Linda knew immediately that he'd saved for this, that he'd sacrificed other wants to afford even this small symbol. Will you marry me? Matt asked, his voice breaking on the question. Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving I'm worthy of you? Linda looked at the ring, at the man offering it, at the life he imagined they'd build together. She saw love in his eyes, genuine, vulnerable, completely certain. She also saw the shadow of assumption, that she needed this security, that marriage to him was a rescue, that her yes would be gratitude as much as affection. But beneath the assumption, she saw the man she'd fallen for, the one who brought her wildflowers and listened when she spoke and cried about his father on park benches, the one who was offering everything he had because he genuinely believed she deserved it. Yes, Linda said, tears spilling before she could control them. Yes, Matt, I'll marry you. Matt slid the ring onto her finger with reverence, then pulled her into an embrace that felt like promises and futures and hope that hadn't been crushed yet by reality. Linda held him tight, feeling the solid warmth of him, the beating of his heart against hers. The absolute certainty that this moment was both beautiful and devastating. "I'll take care of you," Matt whispered into her hair. "I promise. You won't have to worry about anything." Linda closed her eyes against the ache of those words. "I know you will." They sat on that bench for another hour, Matt talking excitedly about their future, the apartment they'd find together, the life they'd build, the family they might create. Linda listened and nodded and smiled, all while feeling the weight of her ring and her secrets pressing down with equal force. That evening, Matt called his family. Linda listened to his joy spill through the phone, heard his mother's tears and his sister's squeals and his brother's congratulations. When he handed her the phone, Linda spoke to people who welcomed her with open arms and hearts that didn't know enough to be guarded. "We can't wait to meet you properly," Matt's mother said, her voice warm as summer. "Matt talks about you like you hung the moon. He's generous with his interpretations," Linda replied softly. "No, honey. He's in love. There's a difference." After the calls ended, Matt pulled Linda close on the couch in her small apartment. "I want to do this right. The proposal, the engagement, all of it. You did do it right. I mean the celebration. I want to throw a party, invite people, show the world that I'm the luckiest man alive." Linda felt something cold touch her spine. "Matt, we don't need a party. This is enough." "But I want to." Matt's enthusiasm was genuine, unstoppable. "I want my colleagues to meet you properly. I want to celebrate this with everyone who matters, please." Linda looked at his face, saw how much this meant to him, understood that his need for public celebration came from wanting to claim this joy openly. How could she deny him that? "Okay," she said quietly. "A party, really?" Matt kissed her, sudden and joyful. "I'll plan everything. You just have to show up and be the incredible woman you are." Over the following weeks, Matt threw himself into planning with the focus he usually reserved for work. He researched venues, booked a ballroom at a hotel that probably cost more than he should spend, arranged catering that would impress people who didn't need impressing. Linda watched him work himself into exhaustion, chasing the perfect celebration. She offered several times to contribute, to help with costs that she could cover without thinking. But Matt refused with pride that was both admirable and frustrating. "I've got this," he'd say firmly. "This is my responsibility, my joy to give you." Linda didn't argue. She recognized male pride when she saw it, understood that Matt needed to feel like he was providing, that his sense of worth was tangled up in his ability to give her things he thought she needed. The invitations went out. Matt's colleagues and friends received elaborate cards announcing the engagement. Linda received a copy in the mail, addressed to her modest apartment, announcing her engagement to a man who thought he knew her, inviting her to a celebration that would reveal how little he actually saw. She stood in her closet, the small one in this small apartment, and chose the simplest dress she owned. Black, elegant, understated, no jewelry except the engagement ring. Nothing that would draw attention or suggest anything beyond ordinary. Across town, in a closet that could hold her entire apartment, Linda's real wardrobe hung in temperature-controlled darkness. Gowns worth more than Matt's car. Jewelry that required insurance policies. The wardrobe of Linda Klein, heir to an empire that had been building itself since before Matt was born. Linda closed the door on that world and chose simplicity. She would go to this party as the woman Matt had proposed to. She would smile and celebrate and let him have his moment of pride. And after would take care of itself. After always did. The night before the party, Linda stood at the window of her modest apartment, looking out at the city spread below her like possibilities written in light. Her phone rang. Her mother. "Are you certain about this?" her mother asked without preamble. "No," Linda admitted, "but I'm certain about him. Beneath everything else, I'm certain about who he could be, and if he can't become that person." Linda touched the ring on her finger, small, honest, chosen with love, if not understanding. "Then at least I'll know I tried, that I gave him the chance to love me without all the complications." "Darling, you are the complications." The wealth, the influence, that's part of you. You can't separate yourself from it forever. I know, Linda's voice was barely audible. But just for a while longer, I want to be loved for being me. Just me. Her mother was quiet for a long moment. Then I hope he proves worthy of you. All of you. After the call ended, Linda sat in darkness and let herself imagine two futures. In one, Matt discovered the truth and loved her anyway, loved her more for the honesty of what she'd been trying to protect. In the other, she would learn that some people could only love the versions of you they felt superior to. The engagement ring caught light from the street below, throwing tiny rainbows against the wall like promises that might shatter before morning. Chapter 4. The night everything shattered. The ballroom glittered with ambition disguised as celebration, chandeliers throwing light that cost more per hour than honesty could afford. Linda arrived alone. Matt had gone early to ensure everything was perfect, to greet guests, to play host in a role that fit him like clothing borrowed from someone else's life. She stood at the entrance in her simple black dress, watching people who measured worth in titles and salaries gather to celebrate something they couldn't begin to understand. The room buzzed with conversation that went nowhere meaningful. Matt's colleagues clustered near the bar, their laughter too loud, their ties slightly loosened, their confidence built on foundations that would crumble under inspection. Derek held court telling stories that made him the hero. Troy kept checking his phone like messages were oxygen. Cameron flirted with a woman who looked interested until she asked what he drove. Linda... Matt appeared at her side, radiant with joy that made her chest tighten. He kissed her cheek, took her hand, pulled her into the room like she was treasure he couldn't wait to display. "You look beautiful." "So do you," Linda said softly and meant it. Matt wore a suit he'd bought specifically for tonight, probably stretching his budget beyond wisdom. But he carried it well, his excitement making him shine despite the expense. "Come meet everyone properly," Matt said, guiding her toward his colleagues. The evening progressed through standard celebration rituals. People congratulated them with smiles that didn't quite reach eyes. Gifts appeared on a table, wrapped boxes that would contain picture frames and serving dishes and things that belonged in lives Linda wasn't sure they'd actually build. Dinner was served with the kind of elegance that comes from someone trying too hard. Champagne flowed in quantities that suggested Matt had prioritized alcohol over practical concerns. The volume in the room increased with each bottle emptied. Linda sat at the head table beside Matt, playing the role of glowing bride-to-be, answering questions about wedding plans with vague enthusiasm. Matt's hand found hers under the table, squeezing gently, his touch reminding her why she'd said yes. Then the speeches began. Matt's brother spoke first, warm stories about growing up together, about Matt's determination and loyalty and heart. Linda found herself smiling genuinely, seeing the man she loved through someone else's affection. Derek went next, his speech veering between genuine friendship and performative humor. He told stories about Matt at work, about late nights and tough clients, and victories earned through persistence. The room laughed at appropriate moments. Then Matt stood up, glass in hand, confidence radiating from him like heat from a flame that was about to burn everything it touched. "Thank you all for coming," Matt began, his voice carrying across the room with ease. "Thank you for being here to celebrate what is undoubtedly the best thing that's ever happened to me." Applause rippled through the crowd. Linda smiled up at him, her face aching from holding the expression. "This woman beside me," Matt continued, gesturing toward Linda with his glass, "is extraordinary. She's kind and intelligent and sees the world in ways that constantly surprise me." Linda felt warmth bloom despite her anxiety. Maybe this would be fine. Maybe he would simply celebrate their love without. "This is my fiancé, everyone," Matt said, his tone shifting into something that made Linda's stomach clench. "She doesn't work yet, but don't worry, I'll take care of her." The room erupted with laughter. Friendly, thoughtless laughter that assumed everyone was in on the same joke. Linda's smile didn't falter. She'd had too much practice controlling her expression to let it slip now. But something behind her eyes went very, very still. Matt didn't notice. He was riding the wave of attention, feeding off the crowd's energy like a man who'd been starving for validation. "After we're married, she won't have to stress about anything," Matt continued, his voice carrying pride that felt like acid on Linda's skin. "I've got this." More laughter. Derek shouted something about being a lucky girl. Troy raised his glass in salute. Cameron called out, "Setting the bar high, Mercer." Matt grinned, absorbing the approval, never once looking down at Linda, never once seeing that the woman he loved was dying quietly beside him while he stood over her corpse making jokes. "Seriously, though," Matt said, his tone attempting sincerity, "I know she's still figuring out what she wants to do with her life, and that's okay. That's what partnership is about, supporting each other. When one of us needs carrying, the other steps up." Linda's hand found her water glass. She drank slowly, mechanically, while screaming echoed in the space behind her teeth that politeness wouldn't let her open. Matt finished his speech with words about love and future and commitment. Words that would have meant everything if he hadn't just spent 5 minutes reducing her to a dependent, to someone incomplete without his intervention, to a problem he was generous enough to solve. The applause when he sat down was thunderous. Matt leaned over and kissed her temple, whispering, "Did I do okay?" Linda turned to look at him, really look at him, and saw a stranger wearing the face of someone she'd thought she loved. "You did exactly what you intended," she said quietly. Matt didn't hear the double meaning. He was already turned away, accepting congratulations from people at nearby tables, basking in approval that cost Linda everything it meant to give. The party continued for another 2 hours. Linda moved through it like a ghost, present but untethered, smiling and nodding and dying incrementally with each congratulation. People kept telling her how lucky she was, how Matt was such a good man, how wonderful it must be to have someone so willing to provide. Not one person asked what she might provide him. Not one person considered that perhaps she brought value beyond the opportunity for his generosity. As the evening wound down, Matt and his friends gathered near the bar, their voices loud with alcohol and camaraderie. Linda watched them from across the room, studied the way they congratulated each other on Matt's engagement like he'd won a competition, like acquiring a wife was an achievement to be celebrated, separate from the actual human being involved. The hotel manager approached Linda discreetly as people began filtering out. "Miss Klein, there's the matter of the bill." Linda glanced toward the bar where Matt stood, oblivious, assuming everything was handled because he'd made arrangements he thought he could afford. She knew without checking that he'd underestimated costs, that the bar tab alone probably exceeded his budget, that come morning he'd wake to credit card bills that would take months to navigate. "Of course," Linda said quietly. She opened her small purse, the one that matched her simple dress, the one that looked ordinary and held extraordinary things, and produced a black card with no spending limit. "Please charge everything to this." The manager took the card, glanced at the name embossed in silver, and his eyes widened slightly before professional training smoothed his expression. "Certainly, Ms. Klein. I'll process this immediately." "Please," Linda added, her voice carrying weight that made the manager stand straighter, "don't mention this to anyone, especially not to Mr. Mercer. Let him believe whatever he needs to believe." Understood completely. The manager disappeared. Linda stood alone in the emptying ballroom, watching Matt laugh with his friends, watching him celebrate a future he thought he understood, watching him be completely certain of realities that were about to reshape themselves around him. She didn't approach him. She didn't say goodbye. She simply walked out of the ballroom, through the hotel lobby, into the night that felt colder than it had any right to be. Linda's car waited where she'd left it, not the modest sedan Matt had seen her drive, but the vehicle she kept for nights when pretending felt impossible. She slid into leather seats that cost more than most people spent on entire cars and sat in darkness, not starting the engine, not moving, just breathing. Her phone buzzed. "Matt, where'd you go? Come back, night's not over." Linda looked at the message, at the exclamation points that demonstrated his complete failure to read the room he'd just destroyed. She typed 4 words, "Heading home. Love you." The lie felt necessary. The truth would come soon enough. She started the engine and drove across the city to her real home, 47 floors above the streets where people who thought they understood influence walked thinking they were mighty. The elevator carried her up in silence. Her penthouse door closed behind her with a sound like finality. Linda walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked down at the city her family had helped build. Somewhere down there, Matt was probably still celebrating, still laughing, still completely unaware that he'd just set in motion something that would reshape his understanding of everything. She pulled out her phone and sent a single message to her executive assistant. "Monday morning. Pull employment files. Mercer, Lansing, Whitmore, Hayes. Have termination packets ready. I'll handle notification personally." The response came within seconds. "Understood. We'll have everything prepared." Linda didn't cry. Tears would come later, maybe, when the numbness wore off and feeling returned like circulation to a limb that had been compressed too long. For now, she stood at her window and watched dawn begin crawling across the skyline. Light bleeding into darkness, day breaking over the wreckage of what she'd hoped could be simple. At sunrise, Linda Klein removed her engagement ring, small and honest and chosen with love that hadn't known enough, and placed it on the marble countertop of her kitchen that cost more than Matt's yearly salary. "Love doesn't mean losing yourself," she whispered to the empty room. And I almost forgot that. The ring sat there catching morning light, throwing rainbows against walls that had never witnessed anything as simple or as devastating as a heart choosing to break itself before someone else could do it for them. Chapter 5. The Reckoning Before Dawn. Sunday moved through hours that felt syrupy and wrong, time behaving like something that had forgotten its proper function. Linda stood in her penthouse kitchen making coffee she wouldn't drink, going through motions that mimicked normalcy while her mind processed everything with surgical precision. Her phone buzzed periodically with messages from Matt, sweet texts about what a perfect night it had been, how happy he was, how much he loved her. Each message landed like a weight on a scale that was tipping toward inevitable. She didn't respond beyond single words. "Yes, good, later." Matt didn't notice the difference. His joy made him blind, or perhaps he'd always been blind, and she'd mistaken it for innocence. By afternoon, Linda had made her decision. She called her chief operating officer, a woman named Diane, who'd worked with Linda's family for decades, who understood that sometimes compassion required cruelty. "I need employment files," Linda said without preamble. "Which ones?" Linda rattled off the names. Matt Mercer, Derek Lansing, Troy Whitmore, Cameron Hayes. She spelled each name carefully, watching the city sprawl beneath her windows like a game board where she just decided to move pieces that didn't know they were being moved. "Personnel action?" Diane asked, her voice neutral. "Termination. Effective Monday. Standard severance, no cause listed beyond restructuring. Keep it clean." Diane was quiet for 3 seconds, long enough to understand this was personal, but professional enough not to ask. "I'll have the packets ready by morning. Do you want HR to handle notification, or I'll handle it personally?" "Understood." Diane hesitated, then added gently, "Linda, are you certain?" Linda looked down at her left hand, where the small engagement ring had sat yesterday, looked at the bare finger that felt lighter and heavier simultaneously. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." She ended the call and moved through the rest of Sunday in a state of crystalline clarity. She showered in a bathroom where the fixtures cost more than most people's cars. She dressed in comfortable clothes that looked cheap but weren't, the kind of wealthy person camouflage that rich people wore when they wanted to move through the world without being recognized. She stood at her window and watched sunset bleed across the city, watched lights begin their nightly bloom, watched people move through lives they thought they controlled. Matt called as evening settled. Linda let it ring twice before answering. "Hey, beautiful." His voice radiated joy. "I've been thinking about last night, about how perfect everything was, about how lucky I am." "It was memorable," Linda said quietly. "I know you left early. You okay? You seemed a little quiet during my speech." "I was tired. Long day." Matt didn't catch the flatness in her tone. "I totally get it. Hey, want to grab brunch tomorrow? Celebrate properly, just the two of us?" "I can't tomorrow. I have something I need to handle." "What kind of something?" Linda looked at her reflection in the window, ghost-like, translucent, caught between who she'd been pretending to be and who she actually was. "Just something that can't wait. We'll talk soon." "Okay." Matt's disappointment was audible but not suspicious. "Love you." "I know you do," Linda said, which wasn't the same as saying it back, but was close enough that Matt wouldn't notice the difference. After the call ended, Linda stood in her darkness and let herself feel everything she'd been suppressing. Rage at Matt's casual diminishment, grief for the relationship she'd believed could transcend surfaces, shame at her own complicity in building an illusion that was always destined to shatter. But beneath those feelings, something harder. Clarity. Understanding that love built on false foundations would eventually collapse. Recognition that Matt had loved a version of her that didn't exist, which meant he'd never actually loved her at all. She pulled out her laptop and began typing instructions for Monday. Detailed protocols for how the terminations would proceed, what would be said, what wouldn't. She outlined exactly how she wanted HR to handle the process, the timeline for badge deactivation, the security measures that would ensure dignity even in dismissal. Diane responded to each instruction with confirmation, never once questioning the decisions. This was necessary, even if it was tangled with personal wounds that would scar tissue no contract could heal. At midnight, Linda closed her laptop and returned to the windows. The city had settled into its late-night rhythm, fewer lights, more shadows, the hour when truth felt possible because fewer people were awake to deny it. Her phone buzzed one last time. "Matt, dreaming of our future. Can't wait to build it with you." Linda didn't respond. She stood at her window until dawn began its slow crawl across the horizon. Stood there while night surrendered to day. Stood there watching the sun rise on the morning when Matt Mercer would discover that the woman he'd thought needed saving owned the ground he stood on. When first light touched the highest buildings, Linda dressed with care. Professional suit tailored perfectly, understated jewelry that whispered wealth to people who knew how to hear it, hair pulled back with severity that matched her mood. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw Linda Klein, not the modest woman who climbed stairs to small apartments, but the woman who signed documents that moved millions, who sat on boards that shaped policy, who carried her family's legacy in her spine and her grandmother's steel in her gaze. She walked to her kitchen counter, where the engagement ring still sat throwing morning light. Picked it up, studied it one final time. Such a small thing to represent such large assumptions. She placed it in a velvet box she'd leave with Matt's belongings. Closed the lid on what could have been, if only he'd seen her. Linda left her penthouse as the city woke fully, rode her private elevator down to the garage where her actual car waited, sleek, expensive, unmissable. She drove across town to Klein headquarters, parked in the spot that had been hers since she was old enough to understand what ownership meant. Diane met her at the elevator with files and coffee and an expression that conveyed sympathy without being unprofessional. "Everything's ready. HR is standing by. Security has been briefed. They can be here within 10 minutes of your call." "Good." Linda took the files, flipped through documentation that would end 4 careers with signatures that wouldn't even slow her hand. "Contact the subsidiary. Have them send badge deactivation notices exactly at 9. Not a minute before." "Done." Linda walked to her office. The real one, 40 floors up, with views that made people understand why eagles chose heights. She sat at her desk and waited for 9 o'clock, with the patience of someone who'd spent their whole life learning that influence was nothing if you didn't know when to use it. Her phone buzzed with frantic messages starting at 9:03. Matty, something's wrong with my badge. Can't get in. Security says I'm deactivated. Derek in a group chat. What the hell? Anyone else locked out? Troy. Me too. This has to be a mistake. Cameron. Calling HR now. This is insane. Linda watched the messages pile up, watched panic spread through digital communication, watched men who'd felt secure 15 minutes ago realize that security was always an illusion. At 9:15, her phone rang. Matt. She let it ring 4 times before answering. Linda? Thank God. Something crazy is happening at work. They're saying I'm terminated, but that's impossible. I need to... Matt, Linda interrupted gently. It's not a mistake. Silence on the other end. Then what? Go to Klein headquarters. Top floor. Tell security that Ms. Klein is expecting you. Bring Derek, Troy, and Cameron. You'll all receive answers together. Klein headquarters. Why would... Linda, what's going on? You'll understand soon. Linda's voice carried no emotion, no hint of the woman who'd stood in galleries looking at honest messes. 30 minutes. Don't be late. She ended the call before Matt could respond, before his voice could remind her that the man she'd loved existed somewhere beneath the man who'd humiliated her. She had work to do, and mercy had no place in restructuring. Diane appeared at her door exactly on schedule. They'll be here within the half hour. Do you want me present? No, this I do alone. Linda stood and moved to the windows, looking down at the city where 4 men were probably racing through traffic right now, confused and terrified, and still completely unaware of what was waiting for them. She thought about Matt's speech, about his laughter, about the assumption that she needed his protection, his provision, his generosity to survive in a world that would otherwise crush her. She thought about the ring in the velvet box in her purse, about wildflowers wrapped in newspaper, about a man who'd seen depth in her, but had never imagined that depth might contain influence that eclipsed his completely. I'm sorry, Linda whispered to the city, to herself, to the version of their future that was dying before it could be born. I'm sorry you never really saw me, but she wasn't sorry enough to stop what came next. At 9:45, security called up. Ms. Klein? 4 men here to see you. Matthew Mercer, Derek Lansing, Troy Whitmore, Cameron Hayes. Linda straightened her suit jacket, checked her reflection in the window, became the woman these men would meet for the first time, even though one of them had proposed marriage to someone he'd thought was her. Send them up, Linda said, her voice carrying authority that could reshape buildings. It's time they learned exactly who I am. Chapter 6. The Woman They Never Saw. The elevator doors opened with a sound like a tomb unsealing, and 4 men stepped into a hallway that cost more per square foot than most people earned in months. Matt entered first, his confusion evident in the way his eyes tried to map this unfamiliar territory. Derek followed with false bravado already crumbling at the edges. Troy kept glancing around like the walls might attack. Cameron's confidence had abandoned him somewhere between the lobby and this floor that existed in a different atmosphere than the one where ordinary people breathed. Security escorted them down corridors lined with portraits of industry founders, men and women who'd shaped the city's bones, who'd built empires from vision and steel and willingness to make decisions that destroyed small worlds to create larger ones. Their faces stared down with expressions that knew exactly what influence cost and what it bought. The final doors were solid oak, imported from somewhere that still had forests, carved with geometric patterns that suggested order while hiding chaos. Security opened them without ceremony, gestured for the men to enter, then closed the doors behind them with finality that felt like judgment. The boardroom stretched before them, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city that looked small from this height. A table that could seat 20 but held only one person. At the head of that table sat a woman in a tailored suit that probably cost more than the engagement party they'd attended. Her hair pulled back with precision that matched the lines of the room. Her expression carved from marble that had forgotten how to feel. Matt stopped walking. The sound that came from his throat was neither word nor breath, but something between. Recognition colliding with impossibility, creating noise that defied language. Linda? His voice cracked on her name like glass under pressure. She didn't stand, didn't smile, didn't offer any of the warmth they'd built over months of careful construction. She simply existed in her authority, letting them see her finally, completely, without the filters of modesty and misdirection. "Miss Klein, actually," Linda said, her voice carrying across the room with weight that made all four men take an involuntary step backward. "Linda Klein, Esther Klein Industrial, which owns the parent company that employs you." "Employed you," Derek laughed, a nervous, disbelieving sound that died when he saw Linda's expression didn't change. "This is a joke. Some kind of weird reality show thing. Matt, tell her this isn't funny." Matt couldn't speak. His brain was trying to reconcile the woman who'd climbed stairs to a modest apartment with the woman sitting at the head of a table that commanded a room that commanded a building that commanded the city, visible through windows that framed her like... "No joke, Mr. Lansing," Linda continued, her gaze shifting to Derek with precision that felt surgical. "Your termination letter is not a joke. Neither is the agreement you signed upon hiring, which you violated by discussing proprietary development details at a public gathering. That alone is grounds for immediate dismissal." Derek's face went pale. "I didn't. I was just... You were drinking with colleagues at a bar adjacent to competitors' known gathering location, speaking loudly about project timelines and client relationships. We have witnesses. We have recordings from security cameras that captured your carelessness. We have legal standing that would survive any challenge you'd consider mounting." Troy found his voice. "You're saying you had us fired because we... I'm saying I exercised authority over personnel decisions in a company I control," Linda interrupted. "Your terminations are legal, documented, and final." Cameron stepped forward, his hands raised in what he probably thought was peaceful gesture. "Look, Linda, Miss Klein, whatever this is, can we talk about it? We all made mistakes, but surely..." "Surely what, Mr. Hayes?" Linda's eyebrow raised fractionally. "Surely I should ignore that you've created hostile work environment complaints from 3 different female employees? Complaints that HR documented but didn't escalate because you're friends with people in management. Surely I should pretend I don't know about the expense account irregularities that accounting flagged but never investigated." Cameron's mouth opened and closed without sound. Linda stood finally, the movement drawing every eye because authority in motion commands attention in ways stillness never could. She walked along the windows, her heels clicking against marble imported from mountains that still held snow. "I didn't bring you here to negotiate," Linda said, her voice softer now but no less absolute. "I brought you here so you understand exactly who made this decision and why. So you comprehend fully that the woman you laughed about, the woman you assumed was helpless, the woman whose lack of employment you found so amusing, that woman owns the building you worked in. That woman signs documents that determine whether entire divisions continue existing. That woman has more influence in her signature than you'll accumulate in your lifetimes." "Linda, please." Matt's voice finally broke through shock into desperate pleading. "I don't understand what's happening. Why are you doing this?" Linda turned to face him directly for the first time, and something flickered behind the marble, not warmth exactly, but recognition that this man had once mattered before he'd shown her he couldn't see past his own assumptions. "Do you remember your speech, Matt? At our engagement party?" Matt blinked, confused. I said I loved you, that I'd take care of you. You said I didn't work yet. You said I wouldn't have to stress about anything." You told a room full of people that I was someone who needed your protection, your provision, your generosity to survive. I was trying to show how much I cared. No, Linda's voice cut clean. You were trying to show everyone else how generous you were for tolerating my deficiency. You reduced me to a dependent, to a problem you were noble enough to solve, to someone incomplete without your intervention. I didn't mean. You assumed I was powerless. Linda walked toward him slowly, each step measured. You laughed with your friends about how lucky I was. You made jokes about carrying my weight. You never once considered that perhaps I was the one carrying us both. Derek made a sound. Linda's gaze shifted to him like a blade finding flesh. Something to add, Mr. Lansing. You played us. Derek's voice held accusation and fear in equal measure. You pretended to be something you're not. That's fraud or something. I pretended nothing. I simply didn't correct your assumptions. Linda's expression could have frozen oceans. I wore modest clothes because expensive ones are uncomfortable. I lived in a small apartment because large ones feel empty. I took buses because traffic makes travel insufferable. I never lied about who I was. You simply decided who I was based on what you thought I lacked. She returned to her position at the head of the table, standing behind her chair like a throne she'd inherited and earned simultaneously. Here's what happens now, Linda said, her voice returning to pure authority. Your terminations stand. Your severance packages are generous because I'm not cruel, just done. You'll receive recommendations that are honest but not kind. What you do with those things is your concern, not mine. Linda, I love you. Matt's voice broke completely. Whatever I did wrong, I love you, and that has to count for something. Linda looked at him, really looked at him, and allowed herself one moment of grief for what could have been if he'd been different, if she'd been braver, if love was ever actually simple. You loved someone who didn't exist. Matt, you loved the woman you could save, the woman who needed your strength, the woman who would be grateful for your generosity. You never loved me, the actual me, because you never saw her. That's not true. It is absolutely true. Linda's voice carried certainty that left no room for argument. If you'd seen me, really seen me, you would have asked about my dreams instead of assuming I had none. You would have questioned why someone with no job could afford the coffee we drank, the clothes I wore, the ease with which I moved through a world that crushes people without resources. You would have wondered why I never worried, never stressed, never showed fear about finances. She paused, letting the truth settle like dust after demolition. But you didn't ask those questions because you didn't want answers that would complicate your narrative. You wanted someone to save. You wanted to feel important by being needed. You wanted the ego stroke of providing for someone you perceived as less than. I never thought you were less than. Your speech says otherwise. Your jokes say otherwise. Your pride in taking care of me says otherwise. Linda walked to the door, opened it. Security waited outside like punctuation. Now prove you're more than your assumptions. Earn back what you lost, on merit, not entitlement. Show me the man I thought existed beneath the ego. Matt stared at her, tears streaming down his face, his hands helpless at his sides. How do I do that? How do I prove anything when you own everything? The same way everyone else does. Linda held the door open, her message clear. Through work that matters. Through humility that's learned, not performed. Through becoming someone who sees other people as fully human, not as supporting characters in your story of personal greatness. She looked at each man individually. Derek with his bravado shattered. Troy with his confidence demolished. Cameron with his schemes exposed. Matt with his heart visible and bleeding. I'm not your villain, Linda said quietly. I'm just someone who stopped letting you treat her like she was invisible while standing right in front of you. Security stepped forward. The men understood the message without words, needing to reinforce it. They moved toward the door, toward the elevator, toward the exit from a building they'd never been important enough to enter until this moment of their dismissal. Matt stopped at the door, turned back one final time. I'm sorry for everything. For not seeing you. For making you feel small. For being someone you had to educate through cruelty. This isn't cruelty, Linda said, her voice almost gentle. Cruelty would have been letting you continue thinking your assumptions were love. This is mercy dressed as consequence. What you choose to do with it determines whether you deserved it. Matt nodded once, then walked through the door that closed behind him with the finality of futures being rewritten in real time. Linda stood alone in her boardroom overlooking her city, feeling the weight of what she'd just done, settling across her shoulders like expensive fabric that both empowered and constrained. Diane appeared in the doorway. The terminations are processed. Severance paperwork is being delivered. Security confirmed they left the building. Good. Are you all right? Linda looked at her reflection in the window, powerful, untouchable, completely alone. I did what needed doing. That's not what I asked. Linda closed her eyes, allowed herself one moment of weakness where she didn't have to be the woman who made devastating decisions look easy. No, but I will be. Diane left without pushing further. Linda remained at the window as the city conducted its routine beneath her, as people moved through lives that would never intersect with hers, as Matt Mercer walked out of her building and into an education he'd never volunteered for but desperately needed. I loved you, Linda whispered to the glass, to the city, to the ghost of who they'd almost become together. I loved you enough to break both our hearts before they could harden into resentment. The city offered no comfort, but it offered truth. Sometimes love meant being cruel enough to demand growth. Sometimes caring meant refusing to enable comfortable ignorance. Sometimes the greatest gift was showing someone exactly what they'd been too blind to see. Linda picked up her phone and called her mother. It's done, she said simply. Are you destroyed? I'm surviving. That's enough for today. Today, her mother agreed. Tomorrow you'll be stronger. That's how this works. Linda ended the call and returned to her desk, to the work that never stopped needing her attention, to the empire that didn't care if her heart was breaking because empires rarely did. But somewhere across the city, 4 men were beginning the long walk toward understanding that they'd been given something precious, the truth about themselves, delivered by someone who'd cared enough to make it impossible to ignore. Whether they'd use that gift or resent it remained to be seen. Chapter 7. The Fall That Teaches. 3 months felt like 3 years when every morning arrived carrying rejection. Matt's apartment had transformed from a home into a cell where walls pressed closer each week, where furniture he couldn't afford to replace reminded him of confidence that had been debt all along. He woke each morning to alarm clocks that had stopped mattering because time no longer divided into segments that built toward anything. He made coffee he barely drank. He updated resumes that generated automated responses, apologizing for not responding. The termination on his record glowed like radiation, invisible but contaminating everything it touched. Recruiters saw Klein and their voices shifted from interested to professionally distant within sentences. Can you explain the circumstances? They'd ask, their tone suggesting they already knew the answer wouldn't help. Restructuring, Matt would say, the official language that meant nothing and everything. I see. Well, we'll certainly keep you in mind if anything suitable becomes available. Translation. Don't call us. Matt had been unemployed for exactly 7 days when Derek stopped answering his calls. Troy lasted 2 weeks before sending a text that blamed Matt for everything, for getting them fired, for dating someone who turned out to be powerful, for somehow not knowing that the modest woman he'd loved controlled their professional fates. Cameron disappeared entirely, deleted his social media profiles, moved to another city where Klein influence presumably didn't extend. Matt heard through mutual connections that Cameron had found work somewhere smaller, somewhere that didn't ask too many questions. By month 2, Matt had burned through his savings, covering rent on an apartment he should have downsized from immediately. Pride kept him there initially, refusing to admit defeat, clinging to remnants of the life he'd built before it revealed itself as temporary. But pride wasn't paying bills, and landlords didn't accept ego as currency. He took whatever work appeared, contract positions that lasted 3 weeks, freelance projects that paid barely enough to justify the effort, gigs that would have humiliated him before humility became something he'd learned against his will. He worked retail during holiday season, his feet aching from standing, his smile plastic from pretending enthusiasm for purchases that meant nothing. He saw Linda once during this period, completely by accident, in a part of the city he had no reason being in, except that coffee from the expensive shop there was free if you caught them before they threw out yesterday's grounds. She emerged from a building whose lobby dripped marble and meaning, flanked by people in suits that cost more than his current monthly income. Linda wore confidence like some women wore perfume, invisibly but unmistakably. Her hair was different, pulled back in ways that suggested someone styled it professionally each morning. She carried herself with authority that seemed innate, but Matt now knew was cultivated through generations of people who'd learned that influence was something you claimed with your posture. Their eyes met across impossible distance. Linda's expression didn't change, didn't soften, didn't harden. She simply looked at him the way you'd look at someone you used to know in a context that no longer existed. Then she slid into a car that cost more than he'd earned in several years, and the vehicle pulled away from the curb with the silence that only expensive things achieved. Matt stood on that sidewalk with free coffee, grounds and the understanding that he'd lost something he'd never actually possessed. You couldn't lose what you'd never seen. You could only grieve the illusion of having held it. He went back to his apartment and cried for the first time since his father's funeral. Not delicate tears that could be dabbed away, but ugly sobbing that came from somewhere beneath pride, beneath ego, beneath every defense he'd constructed to protect himself from recognizing his own smallness. When the tears ended, when his throat ached and his eyes burned, Matt looked around his apartment, at furniture that was nice but not meaningful, at decorations that suggested taste without having any, at a life that had looked complete but was actually just cluttered, and made a decision. He called his landlord that afternoon. "I need to break my lease. There's a penalty." "I understand. Bill me. I'll figure it out." He found a studio apartment in a neighborhood where success hadn't gentrified existence yet, where people worked multiple jobs and still smiled at each other in hallways, where community was built from necessity rather than chosen from options. The rent was a third of what he'd been paying. The space fit his bed and not much else. It was perfect. Matt sold his furniture, his entertainment system, his car that he'd been making payments on since before payments felt like chains. He kept only what fit in his new space and left his old illusions in the dumpster where they belonged. Stripped of everything he'd thought mattered, Matt discovered something terrifying. He had no idea who he actually was. The version of himself he'd constructed. Ambitious project manager. Generous fiancé, man on his way to significance, had been built from job titles and relationships and acquisitions that had been taken away or revealed as fantasies. Without those external markers, he was just a person who'd been cruel to someone kind and was now suffering appropriate consequences. Month 3 arrived with winter's first serious cold. Matt walked to the library because his studio didn't have space for books and the library had heat. He spent hours there, not reading anything specific, just existing in a space that expected nothing from him except basic human decency. One afternoon, a flyer on the bulletin board caught his attention. Community Development Assistant Needed. Nonprofit housing advocacy. Pay is minimal. Impact is everything. Matt stared at that flyer for 15 minutes. Minimal pay meant poverty-level wages. Non-profit meant no prestige, no advancement track, no cocktail party conversations about impressive-sounding responsibilities. It meant real work helping real people in real ways that wouldn't inflate his ego or his bank account. He pulled out his phone, called the number on the flyer. "Hello?" The voice sounded harried, background noise suggesting chaos, a standard operating procedure. "I'm calling about the development assistant position." "You have non-profit experience?" "No." "Community organizing background?" "No." "Why are you calling?" Matt paused, considering lying, then remembered lying had gotten him nowhere good. "Because I need to learn what actually matters. And I think working with people who know might teach me." Silence on the other end. "Then can you start tomorrow?" "Yes, be here at 7. Bring work gloves. We're building planter boxes for a community garden. Pay is minimal. No benefits for 3 months. You're competing with people who actually need this job. So if you're looking for redemption tourism, save us both the time." "I'm not," Matt said, and realized as he said it that it was true. "I'm looking for work that matters more than I do." 7 tomorrow. "Don't be late." The call ended. Matt looked at his phone, at the address he'd been given in a neighborhood he'd never visited on purpose, and felt something shift in his chest. Not hope exactly. Hope was too ambitious, too forward-looking. This was simpler. Willingness. Willingness to show up. Willingness to be small. Willingness to serve instead of being served. That night, Matt lay in his studio apartment with its cracked ceiling and heating that worked mostly, and thought about Linda, about the woman he'd never actually known, who'd tried to show him herself, and he'd been too blind to see anything except what he wanted. About the influence she'd held so quietly that he'd mistaken her silence for emptiness. He thought about his speech at the engagement party, about words that had seemed loving but had been condescending, about laughter that had felt inclusive but had been dismissive, about the moment Linda's eyes had changed while he'd been too drunk on attention to notice. He thought about the ring he'd saved months to afford, about how proud he'd been of that saving, about how he'd never considered that perhaps Linda hadn't needed a ring from him because she could have bought the entire jewelry store where he'd made his thoughtful purchase. But mostly, he thought about the moment in her boardroom when she'd told him he'd loved someone who didn't exist, about how devastating that truth felt and how right. He pulled out a notebook he'd bought from a dollar store and started writing. Not a letter to Linda. He had no right to her attention yet, maybe ever. Just thoughts, observations, truths about himself he'd been avoiding since always. "I made you small because I needed to be big," he wrote. "I thought love was about providing instead of partnering. I assumed your silence meant emptiness instead of depth. I measured worth in outputs I could see instead of value that existed beyond my limited sight. I was blind, not because you were hiding, but because I was only looking for versions of you that confirmed what I already believed." He filled pages, not for redemption, not for forgiveness, just for the discipline of honesty he should have practiced before he'd been forced into it. When he finally slept, it was with the understanding that tomorrow would be hard, that minimal pay would mean real struggle, that everything about this new path would challenge his ego in ways he'd worked his entire life to avoid. But at least it would be real. At least he'd be doing something that mattered to someone other than himself. At least he'd be beginning the long work of becoming someone who could look at his reflection without flinching from the stranger staring back. Chapter 8. The Reconstruction of a Soul. Morning came with the kind of cold that reminds you that comfort is a luxury, not a right. Matt stood outside a converted warehouse in a neighborhood where broken glass glittered alongside broken promises, where hope was something you built with your hands because it wouldn't arrive any other way. The sign above the door read, "Riverside Community Advocates," in letters that had been painted over graffiti that would probably return by next week. Inside smelled like coffee that was strong because it had to compensate for being cheap, and purpose that made up for lack of resources through sheer stubborn determination. People moved through cramped space with efficiency born from understanding that wasted motion meant wasted opportunity to help someone who needed helping. "You, Matt?" A woman approached, mid-40s, exhausted eyes, smile that suggested she'd seen enough disappointment to recognize it approaching. "I'm Valerie. I run this disaster." "That's me." Valerie looked him over with assessment that probably saw right through whatever he was trying to project. "You know anything about community organizing?" "Nothing." "Construction?" "No, less than nothing." "Why are you here?" Matt thought about lying, about spinning some story that would make him sound noble, then remembered nobility had been his problem all along. "Because I spent my life being self-important, and it turns out I was just selfish. I'm trying to learn the difference." Valerie studied him for 3 seconds that felt like cross-examination, then nodded once. "Honest, that's rare. Grab gloves from that box. You're on the build crew. We're constructing raised beds for elderly residents who want to grow vegetables, but can't bend to ground level. Questions?" "Where do I start?" By doing exactly what you're told, without trying to improve the process. People like you always think you've got better ideas than folks who've been doing this work for decades. You don't listen more than you talk. Now move." Matt spent that first day hauling lumber and following instructions from people who knew exactly what they were doing and had no patience for incompetence disguised as enthusiasm. His hands blistered despite gloves. His back screamed by lunch. His pride took continuous beating from corrections delivered by people who cared more about results than his feelings. By evening, he'd helped build 6 raised beds that would let retired teachers and factory workers and people who'd survived things he couldn't imagine grow tomatoes and lettuce and herbs that would matter more than any project he'd managed in his previous life. Valerie found him at day's end, examining his bleeding palms with expression that suggested he was rethinking life choices. "You coming back tomorrow?" Matt looked at his hands, at blood that proved effort, at pain that taught lessons. "Yes." "Why?" "You clearly aren't built for this, because this matters. Your work actually helps actual people in actual ways. That's more than I can say about anything I've done." Valerie's expression softened incrementally. "You get that everyone here is suspicious of people like you, right? People who show up from comfortable lives thinking they're going to save us with their newfound consciousness. I'm not trying to save anyone. I'm trying to figure out if I'm worth saving. That's less arrogant than most." Valerie handed him a tube of antibiotic ointment. "For your hands. Be here tomorrow at 7. We're doing intake interviews with families applying for housing assistance. You'll observe and learn how to listen without trying to solve." Matt came back the next day, and the day after, and the one following that. He showed up early and stayed late, not because he was trying to impress anyone, but because the work was endless, and every hour he contributed meant something got done that wouldn't have otherwise. He learned to listen to stories that broke his heart. Families living in cars, children sleeping in shelters, people working 3 jobs and still unable to afford apartments in a city that had decided they didn't deserve space. He learned that poverty wasn't a failure of character, but a structural condition that crushed people regardless of their effort. He met Jasmine, a woman who worked overnight stocking shelves so she could be home when her kids returned from school, who was facing eviction because her landlord had decided the neighborhood was ready for development that didn't include her. Matt helped her fill out paperwork for emergency assistance, sat with her while she cried from exhaustion and terror, learned that sometimes helping meant just being present while people suffered, because suffering witnessed was less isolating than suffering alone. He met Benjamin, a veteran whose disability checks didn't cover rent in a city that had gotten expensive while he'd been overseas, having his life destroyed for reasons politicians never adequately explained. Matt helped Benjamin navigate systems designed to exhaust people into giving up. Learned that those systems weren't broken. They were working exactly as intended to exclude people deemed inconvenient. He met Elena, a woman escaping violence who needed housing that her abuser couldn't find, who trusted Riverside because they'd never betrayed anyone's location who looked at Matt with suspicion until he proved through weeks of consistent presence that he wasn't going to disappoint her like every other man had. Months passed. Matt stopped counting them because counting suggested he was waiting for this phase to end, to upgrade back to something better. This was his life now. Minimal pay that required careful budgeting, work that exhausted him, purpose that sustained him in ways ambition never had. He discovered he was good at certain things when ego wasn't driving his performance. He could explain complicated processes in language that made sense to people who'd been intimidated by deliberately complex forms. He could advocate for clients in meetings with officials who'd learned to ignore poor people but couldn't quite ignore Matt's polite, relentless insistence that people deserved dignity. He got promoted, if promotion was the right word, for taking on more responsibility without corresponding pay increases. Valerie made him lead organizer for a housing development project, converting abandoned buildings into affordable units for families on waiting lists that stretched beyond hope. The work was tedious. Permits and codes and negotiations with contractors who wanted to charge too much and city officials who wanted to approve too little. Matt threw himself into the tedium because tedium was where real change lived. In details, most people found too boring to master. One evening, working late in the warehouse office, Matt drafted a proposal for innovative funding that would let Riverside purchase properties before developers could gentrify them out of reach. He spent hours researching comparable models, building budgets, crafting language that might convince foundations and donors that prevention was cheaper than emergency intervention. He submitted the proposal to funding competitions. Most rejected it immediately. 3 asked for more information. 1, a small foundation focused on community-led development, invited Riverside to present. Matt worked with Valerie and their tiny team to prepare a presentation that centered actual resident voices instead of savior narratives. They brought Jasmine and Benjamin and Elena to tell their own stories, to explain what affordable housing meant in their own words. They won the funding. Not enough to solve everything, but enough to start, enough to matter. The night they received confirmation, Valerie bought cheap champagne and gathered the team in the warehouse that had become their shared home. "This is because of you," she told Matt, raising her plastic cup. "Your proposal got us here. This is because of all of us," Matt corrected. "I just wrote down what everyone else was already doing." Valerie smiled. "You've learned something." "What's that?" "How to get out of your own way." Matt thought about that phrase constantly afterward, getting out of his own way, stopping the performance of importance, ceasing the need to be central to every narrative. Learning that contribution didn't require recognition to have value. He thought about Linda often, though he never tried to contact her. He saw her occasionally in news coverage, her company expanding into sustainable development, her name attached to initiatives that reshaped policy, her face on magazines beside headlines about innovation and influence. Each sighting was a reminder of how little he'd understood when he'd thought he was qualified to take care of her. Each article reinforced that Linda Klein didn't need anyone's protection. She was too busy, protecting entire communities through strategies that made his current work look small by comparison. But his work didn't feel small. It felt right-sized. It felt like what he was meant to contribute. Not grand gestures that made him feel important, but consistent presence that made actual difference to specific people whose names he knew. One day, working with Elena to move her family into a unit Riverside had secured, Matt realized he was happy. Not the manic happiness of achievement or the proud happiness of status, but the quiet happiness of knowing the day had mattered. Elena hugged him as her children ran through rooms that were theirs, that were safe, that were possible because people had worked together to create something that shouldn't have existed in a city that preferred profit to people. "Thank you," Elena whispered. "You gave us home." "We gave you home," Matt corrected gently. "All of us together." That night, Matt sat in his studio apartment that felt less like deprivation and more like appropriate size, and wrote in his journal that had become spiritual practice rather than guilt management. "I spent years trying to be impressive," he wrote. "I thought importance came from being large, from standing over others, from being the solution to problems that proved I was necessary. I was wrong. Importance comes from being useful in ways that fade into background, from supporting others' success rather than claiming it as your own, from understanding that the best contributions are the ones where you're barely visible because the work itself shines." He thought about sending this to Linda, then decided against it. She didn't need his growth reports. His development wasn't her responsibility to witness or validate. If he ever saw her again, if fate or coincidence or deliberate effort ever put them in the same space, he would show her through how he lived rather than what he said. He would demonstrate through consistent action that he'd learned the lessons she'd taught him at extraordinary cost to them both. Until then, he would keep showing up at 7, keep listening to stories that broke and rebuilt his heart, keep doing work that mattered to people who mattered, keep becoming someone who could look at his reflection and recognize the stranger as someone he might actually respect. Chapter 9. The Long Road to Worthiness. 4 years rebuilt a person more thoroughly than 4 decades of comfortable existence ever could. Matt stood in a community center that Riverside had renovated from abandoned church into vibrant gathering space, watching children play in the after-school program he'd helped develop. The walls held art created by residents. The shelves contained books donated by people who understood that reading was resistance. The rooms buzzed with programs that proved community was built through attention and consistency rather than grand interventions. Valerie approached with papers that meant something new needed handling. "We got the notification. The city's considering our expansion proposal. The one for permanent supportive housing?" "That's the one. They want us to present next month. Full council meeting." Matt took the papers, scanned the requirements. Extensive documentation, data analysis, community impact projections. Exactly the kind of detailed work that made most people's eyes glaze, but where real change lived. "I'll get started on the research tonight." "You mean we'll get started?" Valerie corrected. "You still occasionally slide back into solo hero mode." Matt laughed, genuine and self-aware. "Fair. We'll get started. Want to draft the outline together tomorrow?" "Better." The expansion proposal represented massive scope increase. Riverside wanted to create housing that provided not just shelter, but integrated support services for people experiencing chronic homelessness. Medical care, mental health support, job training, community building. The model worked everywhere it had been implemented, but required upfront investment that made politicians nervous, despite long-term savings. Matt spent weeks coordinating with team members, gathering stories from residents whose lives had been transformed by stable housing. Assembling data that proved human dignity was also fiscal responsibility. He reached out to experts nationally, building a coalition of support that demonstrated this wasn't experimental, but proven. He worked late most nights. His studio apartment transformed into command center of documents and research and determination. He'd learned to live on minimal sleep, to substitute coffee for meals, to push himself beyond comfortable limits because the work mattered more than his comfort. One evening, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. "Matt Mercer, speaking. This is Diane Sullivan. I work with Klein Industries. Ms. Klein asked me to reach out regarding your organization's expansion proposal." Matt's heart stopped functioning briefly. "I'm sorry, what?" "Ms. Klein has been reviewing community development initiatives across the city. Your work with Riverside came to her attention. She'd like to discuss potential partnership opportunities." "Partnership opportunities?" Matt repeated, his brain trying to process that his Linda, The woman he'd loved and lost and learned from had been watching his work. If you're interested, Ms. Klein would like to schedule a preliminary meeting. No commitments, just conversation about possible alignment between Riverside's objectives and Klein's community investment goals. Matt looked around his apartment, at the life he'd built from rubble, at the work that had saved him by giving him purpose beyond himself. Meeting Linda again terrified him. Facing her, knowing what he now understood about both of them, felt impossible. But refusing would be cowardice, and he'd spent 4 years learning courage. When would Ms. Klein like to meet? Are you available next Tuesday? 10 in the morning? I'll make myself available. Diane provided details. Not the corporate tower where he'd been destroyed, but a coffee shop. The same one where he and Linda had their first real date, where he'd brought wildflowers wrapped in newspaper, where everything had started before it ended. After the call ended, Matt sat motionless for 20 minutes. Then he called Valerie. Klein Industries wants to meet about potential partnership. Valerie was quiet, likely processing implications. Linda Klein? The woman who... Yes, Matt, this could be amazing for Riverside. Their resources could transform everything we're trying to do. I know. But if there's history that makes this complicated... There's history, Matt interrupted. Extensive history. But I won't let my past mistakes compromise Riverside's future opportunities. I'll go to this meeting and represent our work professionally. Whatever exists between me and Linda doesn't matter compared to what this partnership could mean for people who need housing. That's growth. Talking. That's 4 years of learning. Talking. Then go to the meeting. Let the work speak for itself. The days until Tuesday moved like sludge and lightning simultaneously. Too slow because he was dreading confrontation. Too fast because he wasn't ready to face what he'd destroyed. Matt prepared obsessively, assembling folders of documentation, rehearsing talking points, reminding himself this was about Riverside's mission, not his redemption. Tuesday arrived wrapped in autumn that hadn't decided whether it was summer's end or winter's beginning. Matt dressed carefully, professional but not expensive, clean but not trying too hard. He looked at himself in the mirror and saw someone he mostly respected, which was improvement on the stranger he'd been 4 years ago. He arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early. It looked exactly the same. Same mismatched furniture, same amateur art, same baristas who remembered regular customers' orders. He bought coffee he wouldn't drink and sat at a table by the window where he could watch for Linda's arrival. She appeared exactly on time, emerging from a car that was nice but not ostentatious, dressed in a way that suggested authority without requiring announcement. Her hair was different, shorter and more severe. Her face carried lines that hadn't been there before, earned from years of making decisions that affected thousands. She was more beautiful than he remembered, and more distant, and more completely herself. Linda entered the coffee shop, scanned the room, found Matt immediately. Her expression didn't change. No warmth, no coldness, just professional neutrality that hurt more than anger would have. She crossed to his table, didn't offer her hand. Matt, Linda, Ms. Klein, I'm not sure what... Linda's fine. We've moved beyond formality pretending to mean anything. She sat across from him, ordered coffee from the hovering barista, waited until they were alone before speaking again. I've been following Riverside's work, Linda said without preamble. Your housing advocacy, the development projects, the funding you've secured through innovative proposals that most organizations wouldn't attempt. Our team is exceptional. Your team is adequate. You're exceptional. Don't deflect. Matt felt heat rise in his face. I learned from the best teacher. Painful lessons tend to stick. Linda's expression flickered, something that might have been pain or pride or both. I didn't reach out to relitigate the past. I reached out because Klein Industries is launching a major community investment initiative. We're allocating significant resources to organizations doing real work, not performative work. Riverside qualifies. What kind of resources? Funding for your expansion proposal. technical support for navigating regulatory requirements, access to our network of contractors who'll bid fairly instead of exploiting non-profits, potential for long-term partnership that could transform Riverside from small organization into regional model. Matt's breath caught. What Linda was describing would solve every resource limitation Riverside faced, would let them scale their impact exponentially, would mean hundreds of families could access housing instead of dozens. That's extraordinary, he managed. It's strategic, Linda corrected. Klein Industries benefits from stable communities. Investing in housing advocates creates stronger neighborhoods, which creates better conditions for everyone. This isn't charity, it's intelligent allocation. Still extraordinary. Linda looked at him directly for the first time, really looked at him, and Matt saw her taking inventory of changes. His hands, scarred from construction work. His face, leaner from years of inadequate nutrition and adequate purpose. His eyes, which probably reflected growth earned through consequences he'd deserved. "You're different," Linda said quietly. "I had to be. Most people don't. Most people who get fired blame everyone except themselves and learn nothing. I blamed myself plenty, but eventually I realized blame was just another form of self-centeredness. The work mattered more than my feelings about the work." Linda nodded slowly. "That's wisdom that usually takes longer than 4 years. 4 very long years." They sat in silence that wasn't comfortable but wasn't hostile. Just space between two people who'd been intimate and were now strangers, trying to determine if professional collaboration was possible. "I need to know something," Linda said finally. "Are you doing this work because you believe in it, or because you're trying to prove something to me?" Matt considered lying, considered saying what would sound best, then remembered that lying to Linda had never worked and wouldn't start working now. Both, initially. "I started at Riverside because I needed to learn what mattered, but I stayed because the work became more important than why I started. The people I serve, they don't care about my journey. They need housing. They need someone to fight systems designed to exclude them. That need exists whether I'm redeemed or not. And now, after 4 years, now I do this work because it's who I am. Not who I'm trying to become, but who I've already become through showing up consistently. The version of me you knew doesn't exist anymore. He died sometime around month 6, and I built someone new from what remained." Linda was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried something softer than the professional tone she'd maintained. "I review every organization we consider for partnership personally. I read every proposal, every report, every outcome measure. When Riverside crossed my desk, I didn't recognize the organization name initially. But when I saw the lead organizer's name," she paused, took a breath that looked like it cost something. "When I saw your name, I could have assigned the review to someone else." "Should have, probably. But I wanted to see what you'd built after everything fell apart. I wanted to know if you'd learned or if you'd just found new ways to be the person you were. And you learned." Linda's eyes held something that might have been pride. "You learned everything I hoped you would, and some things I couldn't have predicted. The man who wrote these proposals understands structural inequality, centering community voice, building influence with people instead of for them. That man is someone I respect professionally." "Just professionally?" Linda looked away, and Matt saw the question had crossed a boundary he shouldn't have approached. "I'm sorry. That was inappropriate. This is a professional meeting about a professional partnership. My personal feelings don't—" "Your personal feelings will always be relevant," Linda interrupted. "We have history that doesn't evaporate because time passed. But whether that history becomes obstacle or asset depends on how we choose to handle it. What do you choose?" Linda met his eyes again, and Matt saw complexity there. Longing and wariness and curiosity and caution, all tangled together in ways that suggested she'd been thinking about this meeting as obsessively as he had. "I choose to explore partnership between Klein Industries and Riverside. I choose to see if we can work together productively. I choose to believe that people can grow past their mistakes if they're willing to do the work. That's generous." That's strategic, Linda corrected again. Riverside is doing important work. Klein Industries should support important work. That it's being led by someone I used to know is almost coincidental. Almost. The word hung between them, acknowledging that nothing about this was actually coincidental. That Linda had chosen to reach out knowing exactly what it would mean. That they were both making deliberate decisions to see if the people they'd become could build something the people they'd been had destroyed. What happens next? Matt asked. Next, you submit formal proposal outlining Riverside's expansion plans, including detailed budgets and implementation timeline. My team reviews it, likely recommends some modifications. If everything aligns, we execute partnership agreement and begin collaboration. How long does that process usually take? 3 to 6 months, depending on complexity. And we'll be working together during that time? You'll be working with my team. I oversee the process, but I'm not day-to-day involved. Matt nodded, understanding the boundary Linda was establishing. Professional distance made sense. Probably necessary, definitely wise, but still disappointing in ways he didn't have the right to feel disappointed about. I should get going, Linda said, standing. I have another meeting across town. Send the formal proposal to Diane by end of month. She'll coordinate everything from there. Linda turned to leave, then paused. Without turning back, she said quietly, I'm proud of you, Matt, for what you've built, for who you've become. That probably doesn't mean anything to you anymore, but I wanted you to know. It means everything, Matt said, his voice barely audible. It always will. Linda left without responding. Matt sat alone with cold coffee, and the understanding that whatever happened next, whether partnership flourished or failed, whether he and Linda ever found their way back to anything beyond professional courtesy, he'd already received what he'd needed most. Recognition that he'd become someone worthy of respect. He pulled out his phone and texted Valerie. Meeting went well. Partnership looks promising. I'll brief you tomorrow on next steps. Then he sat in the coffee shop where it had all begun, where he'd been young and stupid and certain of things he hadn't understood, and let himself believe that maybe, some things broken thoroughly enough could eventually be rebuilt stronger than they'd been before. Chapter 10. Destiny, Reborn Through Fire. The summit filled a convention center with people who shaped cities through decisions made in rooms most citizens would never enter. Matt stood backstage reviewing notes, nervous energy thrumming through his body. 4 years of presenting to hostile city councils had taught him that terror could transmute into strength if you cared more about the message than the messenger. You're on in 5, a stage manager said. Matt nodded, straightened his tie, and walked toward the wings. His presentation slot was late afternoon when attention flagged. Matt had learned that disadvantageous slots could be advantages if your content mattered. The introduction came. Polite applause from an audience that had been applauding all day. Matt walked on stage into lights that erased the audience. 4 years ago, I was fired from a job I thought defined me, he began without preamble. Best thing that ever happened to me because it forced me to learn what actually matters. The audience stirred. People checking phones looked up. Matt advanced slides showing Riverside's work, not abstract statistics, but actual humans with names and stories. Elena and Benjamin and Jasmine, whose lives proved that housing wasn't commodity, but foundation for everything else. He spoke for 20 minutes, balancing statistics with stories, proving that housing advocacy wasn't idealism, but practical strategy. He talked about centering resident voices instead of imposing expert solutions. The applause when he finished was engaged, sustained. People had actually listened. Matt fielded questions afterward from officials asking about replication, from funders wanting proposals. He was talking with a city councilwoman about zoning reforms when he saw her. Linda stood at the back in a sharp charcoal suit, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Her attention was focused entirely on Matt. Their eyes met across the room, and Matt felt time slow enough that he could count his heartbeats. He finished his conversation professionally, then walked toward Linda with measured steps. "Ms. Klein," he kept his voice professional. "Mr. Mercer, excellent presentation. Your work has evolved significantly. I learned from a thorough teacher." Something flickered in Linda's eyes. "There's a private reception tonight for major donors and keynote speakers. You're invited." She handed him an embossed invitation, her fingers not quite touching his. "I'll be there," Matt said. The reception was held in a penthouse ballroom overlooking the city. Matt arrived in his best suit and engaged genuinely with attendees, discussing projects, sharing information, listening. He'd learned that networking was relational, not transactional. 2 hours in, Matt stepped onto the balcony for air. The city spread below like promises, written in light. "You've become good at this." Matt turned. Linda stood at the balcony's far end, holding a glass of wine untouched. "Good at what?" "Being present without performing. You used to network like you were collecting trophies. Now you talk to people like they're actually people." Matt moved closer. "I learned that people respond better when you're interested in them, rather than what they can do for you." Most people never learn that. They stood in silence, the city's ambient noise providing soundtrack to unspoken thoughts. "I don't expect forgiveness," Matt said finally. "But I need you to know I proved myself, not to win you back, to become someone I could respect." "Why now?" Linda's question was gentle but direct. "Why this fourth attempt?" "Because the first 3 times I was still trying to reclaim what I lost. Tonight isn't about me. It's about showing you that I finally understand what you tried to teach me in that boardroom." "What did I try to teach you?" "That respect is earned. That love isn't about saving someone or being saved. That you see people for who they are, not who you need them to be." Matt's voice steadied. "I spent 4 years becoming someone who deserves to stand in the same room as you. Not because of status or wealth, but because of character." Linda looked out at the city. When she finally spoke, her voice carried years of weight. "Do you know how many men approached me after we ended? Men with credentials, with wealth? I imagine many, hundreds. Do you know how many I let past superficial conversation?" Matt shook his head. "None, because none of them had been humbled so completely they forgot how to be arrogant. None of them learned that strength is partnership, not dominance." She stepped closer, tears threatening behind her control. "You did something remarkable, Matt. You proved yourself to yourself. That's the only proof that ever matters." "I don't deserve another chance." "No," Linda agreed quietly. "But you've earned the right to try." Linda took one more step, closing the distance to intimacy. "When I met you in that gallery, I saw fire in your eyes. That man was beautiful, but he was buried under ego, so thick I couldn't reach him. I had to let him destroy himself so someone better could be born. And now I see someone who learned that strength is vulnerability. That influence is service. That love is seeing someone fully and choosing them anyway." Matt's hands moved to Linda's waist, slowly. She leaned into his touch like she'd been waiting 4 years for permission. "I can't promise I'll never fail you again," Matt said. "I don't want promises. I want partnership. Then let's build." Matt kneeled right there on the balcony, kneeled not in supplication, but in gratitude. "I proved myself," he said, looking up. "Not for you, for me. Because you cared enough to shatter me when coddling would have been easier." Linda's hand came to her mouth. Tears escaped down her cheeks. "Stand up," she whispered. Matt rose. Linda's hands found his face, trembling fingers tracing changes time had written into his features. "That's the man I fell in love with," she breathed. "Not the one who promised to take care of me. The one who learned we take care of each other." Their foreheads touched, breathing synchronized. "This won't be easy," Linda said. 4 years of hurt stands between us. I know. People will question why I took you back. Let them. Then we start here, tonight, not as who we were, as who we've become." Matt kissed her, not desperate but certain, not claiming but offering. When they broke apart, Linda kept her arms around his neck. 4 years ago, I thought I was offering you my world, Matt said quietly. I was wrong. What I should have offered was myself, including the parts that needed breaking to be rebuilt better. Those broken parts are what made you whole. They stood together, the city sprawling beneath them. Inside, music played, and important people conducted important conversations. But here, two souls who'd been shattered found each other again, not as savior and saved, but as equals. I love you, Matt said simply. I love all of you. The influence I couldn't see before, the strength I mistook for weakness, the extraordinary human you've always been. Linda kissed him again. I love you too. I love who you became when the world stripped away everything you thought you were and forced you to discover what you actually are. They returned to the reception eventually, entering together. People noticed, but neither cared about those conversations anymore. The night ended with promises to talk tomorrow, to begin the slow work of rebuilding trust. Matt returned to his studio apartment that felt less like limitation and more like launching pad. Linda returned to her penthouse that felt less like isolation and more like home waiting to be shared. The city slept and dreamed its million dreams. Somewhere in those dreams, a man and a woman who'd learned that love without respect was fiction chose to try again, not to recapture what had been lost, but to build something they'd never achieved before. Partnership between equals who'd earned their equality through fire. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, truth is enough.